Generally speaking, before 2017's Wonder Woman, female-led superhero movies never succeeded. It would be tempting to blame the culture for this, but no one can deny that the examples we have, like Catwoman and Elektra, are objectively terrible movies. However, in the early days of the big-budget comic book movie, when the first two Superman movies were still fresh in the zeitgeist, and with the Wonder Woman television series remaining enormously popular in syndication, it seemed inevitable that we would get a female superhero movie that could succeed. That's why, when it went into production, expectations were high for the big-screen debut of Supergirl.
I am Kara of Argo City, daughter of Alora and Zor-El, and I don't scare easily.
The Kryptonian refugee colony of Argo City is in crisis. One of its primary power sources, the Omega Hedron, has been lost, and one of Argo City's children, Kara-El, cousin to Superman, has gone to Earth in search of it. There, she takes the identity of Supergirl and her alter ego Linda Lee, while the budding sorceress Selina uses the Omega Hedron for her own evil purposes. With Superman gone, can Supergirl save the world from Selina's malevolent designs, or will Selina use the Omega Hedron to dominate the human race?
If you watched my livestream where I broke down the original plot for Superman 3 as envisioned by producer Ilya Salkind, you'll know that Supergirl was already on his mind. And if you haven't watched that livestream, well, you should, because it's the funniest one I've ever done. And then Superman becomes violent and starts to destroy everything, and Supergirl panics with disbelief, tries everything to play along with Superman's totally unpredictable moments, so she's like a battered wife at this point.
Superman changes out his cape and leotard for a white beater.
I'm sorry, I'll make you a super sandwich.
Get me in the kitchen and bake me a pie.
Anyway, after the character was removed from Superman 3 at the behest of Warner Brothers, plans were drawn up for a full-blown spin-off featuring the Girl of Steel. This movie was then announced by the Salkinds in April of 1982, over a year before Superman 3's release date. They tried to get Richard Lester to come back to direct Supergirl, but he turned them down, as did Robert Wise. Instead, they hired Jenno Schwark on the recommendation of Christopher Reeve, who had previously worked with him on Somewhere in Time. Schwark reportedly got along well with the Salkinds, but he wasn't sure he was the right man for the job and sought out the advice of Richard Donner about the production. As for the script, which underwent multiple revisions all the way up to and well into production, Ilya hired the screenwriter David Odell, due in large part to his handling of The Dark Crystal, because Supergirl was planned from the start to lean much more in the fantasy direction. To play the lead role of Kara/Linda/Supergirl, there was an open casting call that included hundreds of young actresses. Demi Moore and Brooke Shields were both leading contenders, but Schwark turned them down because he wanted an unknown. Thus, it went to a 19-year-old Helen Slater, fresh out of high school and without any major credits to her name. Slater, who, contrary to popular belief, is not related to Christian Slater, underwent extensive physical training and did the vast majority of her own stunts. Schwark wanted her to have the strength of Superman, but he also wanted her to have more graceful, fluid, and feminine movement, so that when she would fly, it would be quote-unquote aerial ballet. Helen Slater was given $75,000 for the part. To appear alongside her, Christopher Reeve initially agreed to reprise his role as Superman. In the original script, Superman greets his cousin upon her arrival and shows her the ropes, so to speak, before enrolling her at Midvale School, which is exactly what happens in Supergirl's comic book origin story. Superman was then supposed to fall under the villain's magic spell, and the movie would be Supergirl's quest to save him. However, a few months before principal photography began, Reeve bowed out. Whether he was tired of playing Superman, he didn't want to be typecast, he was fed up with the Salkinds, he was disappointed in how Superman 3 turned out, he wasn't offered enough money, or, as he put it, he just didn't feel right about it, he took advantage of the fact that he hadn't signed any contracts and was thus free to walk away. Rather than recast the role, something the Salkinds had threatened to do several times, they altered the script, threw in a line of incidental dialogue to explain that Superman was off on an adventure in another galaxy.
Superman has indeed embarked on a special peace-seeking mission to a galaxy scientists estimate may be several hundred trillion light years from our own.
And didn't bother to explain the narrative holes the changes made. I'm not here to Monday morning quarterback a difficult production decision, but in my opinion, the lack of Superman is probably the film's fatal flaw, but I'll talk more about that later. As for the primary villain, Selina, the role was initially offered to Dolly Parton, who turned it down, but was then filled by Faye Dunaway, whose career was still suffering the Hollywood backlash from Mommy Dearest.
No more hangers!
Dunaway enjoyed the more campy and comedic aspects of the script, but was frustrated when Schwark kept insisting that she was supposed to be the straight against her more comedic co-stars, Brenda Vaccaro and Peter Cook, both of whom deliver some of the funniest parts of the movie.
Oh! Thanks.
Hey, no sweat.
What happened?
Oh, nothing much.
Other high-profile actors include Peter O'Toole as Zoltar, Mia Farrow as Allura, and Simon Ward as Zor-El, while Mark McClure returns as Jimmy Olsen.
That's Clark Kent's cousin?
Fame's Maureen Teefy plays Lucy Lane, and a then-unknown Matt Frewer plays one of the stereotypical slimeballs that happened to be Supergirl's first human encounter. The primary love interest, Ethan, meanwhile, is played by Hart Bochner, half a decade before he'd become the coked-up Ellis in Die Hard.
Hans. Bobby. I'm your white knight.
I must have missed 60 minutes. What are you saying?
Filming took place over 4 months in the summer of 1983, primarily in England, utilizing Pinewood Studios and the famous 007 set, along with a few outdoor locations around Scotland. The town of Midvale was entirely constructed on a 10-acre pinewood backlot in order to have more control over this complicated action sequence, and the visual effects work was overseen once again by Derek Meddings and Roy Field. The music was composed by Jerry Goldsmith, who had been Donner's first choice for the original Superman. Goldsmith's score is great, melding the more heroic style of John Williams' Superman score with the fantasy Supergirl called for. But in my humble opinion, it isn't quite as good as Williams' work. Supergirl released in the UK in July of 1984, but the Salkinds wanted to hold it longer so as to not compete with the Olympics. As a result, Warner allowed them to pass the American distribution over to TriStar, but TriStar insisted that nearly 20 minutes be trimmed, even though what was released in the UK, now known as the international version, had already cut out 14 minutes from the original edit. While nowhere near as egregious as the cuts made to Superman 4 a few years later, the end result in the American release loses critical character scenes and exposition. After having watched all 3 versions, I can confidently say that the 139-minute director's cut is by far the best version. Unfortunately, on its initial release, Supergirl only made $14.3 million domestically, on a budget of anywhere between $35 and $60 million. Critics were lukewarm on it, not as critical as they had been for Superman 3, but still hardly enthusiastic, complaining about the slipshod plot, hammy acting, and lack of character development. Despite this, the Salkinds started early development of a Supergirl sequel and were so impressed by Zeno Schwark that they gave him their next project, Santa Claus the Movie, which also bombed. Facing financial ruin, the Salkinds then sold the rights to Superman and his extended family of characters. Helen Slater, though, had a decent career in the 80s, starring in movies like Ruthless People, The Secret of My Success, and City Slickers, and she would later play Superman's birth mother, Lara L., in Smallville, and Supergirl's adoptive mother, Eliza Danvers, in the recent Supergirl TV series. As for my opinion of 1984's Supergirl, let me start by saying that, despite how much the filmmakers try to insist it was made for all audiences, I don't really consider myself a middle-aged man, part of the target demographic. This is a movie designed to appeal more towards teenage girls, which is appropriate, and from that perspective, it's more successful than its reputation suggests. I am glad I reviewed Superman 4 just prior to this because, compared to that train wreck, Supergirl is pretty great. In fact, as a comic book adaptation, I think it's even better than Superman 3. That said, it has a lot of flaws, most of which start at the script stage. There are far too many absurd plot conveniences like Supergirl just happening to be made roommates with Lucy Lane, or that their math teacher just happens to be one of the villains, and there are also too many plot holes, like how Supergirl knows about Clark Kent or how Selina knows about the Phantom Zone. Additionally, the character motivations are underdeveloped, because it's never made clear why Supergirl decides to become a schoolgirl, and it stretches believability that Selina, who watches Linda Lee transform into Supergirl and vice versa, takes so long to realize that the two characters are one and the same, assuming she ever does.
And whenever she shows up, that girl that flies, that Supergirl, isn't far behind.
Maybe they're best friends.
It's also unsatisfying that the primary antagonist spends so much time sitting at her bizarre amusement park home watching events through her magic mirror instead of being an active participant in the action. And she doesn't become a believable threat until the climax, when her motivation drastically changes from just wanting a boy toy to suddenly wanting to turn the town into some kind of police state. However, the filmmaking is still pretty good, even if the plot is a mess. The special effects are good, the set design is immaculate, the music is memorable, and most of the acting is excellent, especially from Helen Slater and Faye Dunaway. I'm a big fan of any scene involving the trio of witches, as those three actors play well off each other and would, in some alternate universe, make a great DC version of an Agatha All Along style series. However, while we're on the subject of the acting, I do have to point out a few bad apples from the opening scene in Argo City. Peter O'Toole, Mia Farrow, and Simon Ward, good though the actors may otherwise be, are just awful in Supergirl.
Without it, this city can't survive more than a few days.
Our lights will grow dim and the very air we breathe so thin.
I know!
But don't get me wrong, I do like this movie quite a bit, more so now that I've seen the director's cut. It's a shame the movie failed to find its audience in theaters, and maybe the lack of Christopher Reeve's Superman was a big part of that failure. If he'd agreed to be in it, at least to pass the torch, and if the script had been more cleaned up, maybe it could have continued the series on Helen Slater's capable shoulders. Then again, if there's anything I've learned covering these Superman films, it's that the what-ifs are almost too painful to contemplate. What we are left with instead are fun, entertaining movies that don't deserve to be held down by unrequited fanboy dreams. And though I wouldn't call Supergirl a masterpiece of cinema or anything like that, I'm happy to consider it a sci-fi/fantasy classic. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. Do you think Christopher Reeve was right to walk away from Supergirl? Let me know in the comments, and while you're there, don't forget to slap those like and subscribe buttons. Thank you for watching, and until next time, when we'll get in our Sunday best for some nachos, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love. As long as you're not hurting anybody.
want to make a very serious proposal.
In that outfit.
This is a leisure suit. I've got 3 days off from those little beasts at Midvale, and I intend to let my hair down.